the center of Jewish life. The centers moved elsewhere, but Judea was devastated, it was depopulated, the temple was gone, so other areas had to kind of pick up the slack after that.
For example, the Jews who remained in Babylonia after the exile founded a Babylonian Jewish community that lasted for 20 centuries.
The Jews managed to maintain a sense of community in Sur and Pumbeditha in Babylon, in Alexandria in Egypt, in Rome, in Greece. There were Jewish communities that set themselves apart from the larger community so that they could live by their own laws and follow their own traditions.
Instead of being temple-centered, Judaism now became synagogue-centered. For centuries, Jews had endeavored to visit the Jerusalem temple as often as possible on one of the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. But this had become increasingly difficult as the Jewish diaspora extended. There was a need for a local outlet for communal worship, and out of this developed the synagogue. The synagogue was a revolutionary concept at a time when pagan temples were perceived to be the deity's physical place of residence, when worship was expressed through sacrifice, and shrines were accessible only to the priestly caste. Apart from the law dictated to Moses on Sinai, God had given Moses further oral instructions. These were handed down by word of mouth from generation to generation, and they were continually expanded so that by the 1st century CE, this oral tradition had reached enormous proportions.
Well, the first piece of rabbinic literature we have, the earliest, is the Mishnah, was probably edited between 200 and 250 of the Common Era, and is the first attempt to explain how to use the Bible and the laws and the rules of the Bible in everyday life in the Roman world. The next important compilation was the Talmud. The Talmud was put in the form that we now have it probably around 550 or 600 of the Common Era, so about 400 years after the Mishnah. And it's a series of discussions, cases, precedents of how to interpret and how to apply Mishnah's understanding of biblical law to the new situations.
The Talmud is a massive work of some 3 million words. It is a complete library comprising a vast and detailed code covering the entire gamut of religious and civil life. Interspersed is lighter narrative material, including anecdotes and legends.
This doesn't seem to have any religious overtones. It's stuff of law school stuff. And what's it got to do with religion? But it does, because it means that people's relationships with others are not going to be based on the power that one person has or the other person lacks. Instead, they're going to be based on a principle of what is right and what is wrong, as enunciated in the rest of the Bible. All coming roughly under, thou shalt not steal. If it's not yours, leave it alone.
And it has been through the Torah, through the Talmud, and through our prayer book that the Jewish community, wherever they have been, have managed to survive as a community.
By the early centuries CE, the Jewish dispersion had reached Arabia in the south, Armenia and Persia to the east, and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. Jews also followed in the wake of the Roman armies into northern Europe, where they established new communities. But the triumph of Christianity in the 4th century heralded tragedy for the Jews.
Well, with the rise of Christianity in about the 4th century, it did change the social and political situation of the Jews in what was left of the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the church really became the one institutional structure that still survived, and it became the de facto government that replaced the Roman Empire.
The Byzantine emperors introduced anti-Jewish laws that were the foundation for centuries of terrible persecution. This legislation was meant to isolate and humiliate the Jews and to outlaw their close connection with Christian society. As the centuries passed, the Church made harsher and harsher laws against the Jews. Jews were marked out as pariahs, and they constantly were the victims of discrimination. Jews were forced to wear special clothing or special badges. They were subject to attacks, expulsions, and massacres. Under these circumstances, it was not surprising that Jews, confined to their own ghettos, became intensely introspective and immersed themselves in their own culture. But there were exceptions in certain places and times. Jews also participated in the Italian Renaissance with contributions in science, literature, philosophy, music, and even dance. Yet overall, the persecutions continued. Judaism has always had a basic strain of optimism. The Jews did not believe in original sin, and after the exile they were sure that eventually God would bring his people back to their land, safe from their tormentors. The prophet Jeremiah had foreseen such a result.
I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the lands where I have driven them, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply.
Through all of this, the great ideal of Jewish society continued to be study, and the learned man, the scholar and rabbi, was the paragon. The Jews had pioneered a universal education in temple times, and they always ensured that their sons studied, often at the Talmudic academies that flourished in many communities. Adults also found time each day to pore over the Talmud. Sometimes this intensive study evoked a negative reaction. For example, an 18th century pietistic movement known as Hasidism rejected the intellectual element of religious life in favor of a more emotional approach.
The Hasidim, led by their founder, the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, in the medieval period, wanted to bring back into Judaism the celebration of life and the joy and that which was always characteristic of Jewish life in its singing and dancing with the Torah and its feeling of fulfillment in this relationship with God.
Following the American and French revolutions, the Jews were no longer seen as inferiors with no rights. Now they became equal citizens. Many Jews began to question traditional teachings and practices. New forms of Judaism emerged. One of the most influential solutions was Reform Judaism.
Reform came along in the early 19th century, and under the impact of modern biblical scholarship, determined that they no longer believed that God gave Torah complete and finally at Sinai, but that Torah was written by many men over several centuries. Therefore, it is not God-given, but God-inspired.
Traditional Rabbinic Judaism now was called Orthodox, to distinguish it from Reform Judaism. While the Jews always knew what they believed, it took a couple of thousand years for them to organize their theology and creed systematically. Unlike Christianity, Judaism never had an official dogma laid down by its authorities. It's true that the Bible is filled with fundamental statements of Jewish belief, but they are scattered. The most crucial sentence appears in the book of Deuteronomy.
Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
This sentence affirms both monotheism and the people's submission to the one God. The biblical concept of creation has various important implications. The universe is seen to be homogeneous, planned, and formed by a single mastermind. This universe is not random, but rather it has a purpose. There was no element of chance in the creation of the structure of the cosmos. Every detail was divinely planned. God did not retire after creation, but instead remains involved in all the affairs of the universe, emerging as the God of history. God's providence continually ensures the existence of the world, which he could bring to an end just as he brought it into being. The human being, fashioned in the divine image, is the climax and the purpose of creation.
God, an image. God doesn't have any image. But man has characteristics of God himself that sets him apart from all other creatures. God has intelligence on his level, in his way. Man has a mind. Whatever intelligence other creatures might have, none of them will devise the theory of relativity. Man can. It's an intelligence. Perhaps more important even than that, I say perhaps, man can make a moral choice. I decide whether to steal or not to steal, whether to humiliate another person or not to humiliate. It's a sin to humiliate a person. I decide that. It's my moral choice. No instinct compels me to do right or wrong. There is no power on heaven or earth that compels man to sin or do a good deed. It's man's decision. No one compels God, no one compels man. That's why we are in his image.
And this is the essence of Judaism. Now the ancient Jews believed that if they followed Mosaic law, they were performing God's will, and that God was beside them.
In Jewish tradition, the men came to the synagogue 3 times a day to worship. And in order to maintain a sense of community, the rabbis required that there be a minyan, a minimum number of 10 men gathered to worship in order to participate in the full worship experience. This was very important, that they depended on each other to maintain this worship relationship with their God.
They composed the prayers of our prayer book about, let's say, 25 centuries ago. They went through the Bible and found expressions that are appropriate for prayer. In one place it says, "Heal me, O God, and I will be healed." Well, there you got it. Great. It's a wonderful prayer. They made one change in it. Not heal me, but heal us. Not I will be healed, we will be healed. This idea, there's a dependency. A community stays there forever. It continues always. The individuals are replaced. The community continues to go. So the community has responsibility for everybody in the community.
The traditional synagogue was the center of all community activity. Here, the Jew lived much of his life, dreamed his dreams, and communed with both God and neighbor.
The synagogue is the focus of community for Jews. The synagogue, essentially, in our tradition, is a house of worship, a house of study, and a house of fellowship. And it is these 3 aspects of synagogue life that brings the community together and keeps it together. Anochi Adonai Elohecha, asher hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim.
Jewish life has always revolved around 2 centers, the synagogue and the home.
The home really has been the sanctuary of Israel. And even though following the destruction of the temple, the whole synagogue movement developed, it was still in the home that Sabbath was observed, the holidays, and there was the richness of the tradition that kept the family observant of that which was holy and that which was precious in their lives.
Guidelines for the relationship between